So years ago, what I want to jump into here this morning is this series that we've been in. Obviously, the truth is in the tension, and it's probably not lost on any of us that there's an election just around the corner, and that's why we're doing what we're doing on Sunday, which is opening this place up so you can come and just find some silence and solitude. And what I'm hoping to do this morning is maybe even give a little more purpose and direction to that time. Years ago, I was in my mid-20s. I was a high school pastor at the time. And that's when I first became acquainted with this guy named Rob Bell. And Rob became a rather celebrity pastor. And I used to always pride myself on saying I discovered Rob Bell before he was famous. And then it hit me this morning on my run, like, who are you kidding? You live in Montana. Like, stuff was out of style before we even learn about it. So, of course, I found Rob when he was already famous. And he's a bit of a lightning rod now, and that's its own thing. But the thing that I heard Rob say way back at this conference in Chicago years ago, 15 years ago, as he was actually justifying why when he planted this church, he started by teaching through the book of Leviticus one chapter at a time, which really what that says is how extraordinary of a communicator he is, because Leviticus wasn't really intended for priests and the Levites. It wasn't even supposed to be a devotional kind of read. But all the same, part of his rationalization for that was he said that the danger is that if we constantly pick and choose where we read in the Bible, and really what he's saying is if we don't at times read the Bible left to right, or at least read books from beginning to end. And the line that he gave, and this has always kind of just stuck with me and challenged me, he said, if we do that, then, or if we don't do that, then we'll constantly, subconsciously at least, be avoiding the texts that make us squirm. And of course, he's speaking to something we all know about our own reality, is that we all gravitate towards ideas that already kind of support our bias, that until we're desperate, we just kind of stick with what we know. And I think probably those of you who read the Bible can go like, yeah, we're prone to that. We develop these sacred texts in our own lives. We all have a canon within a canon, and that kind of is what it is. But what I want to do this morning is, it wasn't my intention to disprove him, but in a sense, what I want to do this morning, though I do personally read the Bible left to right several times in a year, not the whole Bible, but I'll pick a book, I want to look at a few texts that make me squirm. And I think as soon as you see me read them, you'll see that probably the same is true for you, especially when you add our current political, I don't know, dare I call it a crisis, if we add this kind of season that we're in. I think all the more, if nothing else, they're awkward. And let me just say, I think it's important that we remind ourselves that the Bible is written for us, but not to us. And so, of course, there's a context to them, and that's part of the work of interpretation. But let's just jump into this, because I think you'll quickly see what I mean by squirm. Like, we could start in Romans chapter 13. Listen to this. To me, this is absurd. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities. This is Paul writing. For there's no authority except from God, and those authorities that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists authority resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. What do you do with that? I mean, I think I've learned more in the preparation for the study than I have anything else in this, because there is this sense of like, he's right. I've avoided this one for a long time. Like, what do you do with that? And especially what do you do with it with the fact that obviously he's not talking about our governor or our president or our potential next governor or our potential next president. He's talking about Caesar, who, by the way, was anything but Jewish and just or civilized by any metric. What do we do with that? And depending upon our level of Christian sophistication, the way we can kind of weasel out of things, one popular way would be to go, this is what I would do, is go, it's an outlier. It's an exception. Like, Paul says several things that he doesn't always say a second time, and that's a really important interpretive observation. Like, if he doesn't say it multiple times, then we really have to pay attention to what is the context. But it's not the only time Paul said it. In a letter he wrote to Timothy, which was one of his closest followers and protégés, you might say. Listen to this. First of all, then, I urge that supplications, prayers, intercessions, and thanksgivings be made for everyone. Well, that's benign enough. For kings and all who are in high positions, so that we may lead a quiet and peaceable life in all godliness and dignity. This is right and is acceptable in the sight of God our Savior, who desires everyone to be saved and to come to a knowledge of the truth. Again, I ask, what do you do with that? We'll come back to this, but by any modern metric, it's nothing short of selling out. Because Paul's saying, like, let's just go for layups. We just want peace. We'll settle for less than ideal. We just want peace. And even there we can go, well, okay, so Paul's an outlier. I don't like Paul anyway. I try not to read him. I just read the Gospels or whatever might be your stance there. Well, it's not even Paul that's the outlier. I mean, the Gospel of Luke, and I'd love to go for a walk with you if you wanted to process this one, because the Gospel of Luke is definitely positioning Jesus along a similar kind of conversation. But to be more concise, let's just listen to Peter, one of Jesus' closest friends. For the Lord's sake, accept the authority of every human institution, whether of the emperor as supreme or of governors, as sent by him to punish those who do wrong and to praise those who do right. For it's God's will, I have a friend who says, once you play that card, we're done. I can't even have the conversation anymore. I'm not going to tell you God, it's not God's will. For it's God's will that by doing right, you should silence the ignorance of the foolish. And as servants of God, live as free people, yet do not use your freedom as a pretext for evil. And then listen to this. Put this one over your hearth. Honor everyone, love the family of believers, fear God, honor the emperor. Haven't seen that one at the Christian bookstore lately. What do we do with this? And listen, some of you, it's not important that you do anything with this because you're not even sure what you do with God. You're here because she's here, or he's here, or you're there because you're intrigued, or you're intrigued again. And frankly, you don't force yourself to kind of reconcile all the Bible stuff, and I can respect that. I do wonder, though, if what we have here is something that Paul is working on contextually, that whether you believe in God or not can actually really help us as we try to make sense of this political season that we're in. Or those of you that are Christ followers, what do you do with that? And what if this is the type of moment where we remind ourselves that it's not just U.S. history books and it's not just world history books, but the Bible that holds this principle that the victors get to write the history. Like there's no denying that. And that doesn't, for me, change that God was involved in the Bible, but that's true in the Bible as well. Like an example of that would be the conversation in the Old Testament around, should there be one place to worship Yahweh? Should there be one in Jerusalem and one in Samaria? Or should there be multiple places? An honest, critical reading of the Old Testament would see that there were different opinions on that very subject. And the reality is that if you go like, well, no, it's one place in Jerusalem. I don't disagree with that. I think God agrees with that. But at the very least, one thing that we have to acknowledge from the human side of the Bible is the reason that the Old Testament, the Jewish Bible says that is because that's the voice that won out. There was God-fearing people. There were God-fearing people who disagreed on that very issue. And it seems to me, and I guess this is kind of where, and I'm indebted to N.T. Wright on this one per usual, but that part of what's going on here from Paul, it happens along a similar line. That in Paul's day, one of the triggers for me has been hearing people say, this is the most important election of our lifetime. I frankly wonder to what degree that's maybe emotionally manipulative, and if that's not somewhat of a perpetual statement. Because even within human history, Paul and his people, they would have known this kind of tension. And in Paul's day, when it came to what do we do with foreign rulers, there was a few options. Places like Gamla, they represent one of the options, and that option was we arm up and we resist the unjust leadership that we're being inflicted by. And Jesus in Luke seems to address that crowd directly when he says, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, if only you knew what would bring you peace. There was another faction, and John the Baptist, we think, came from a faction much like this, that were more like our Amish, the equivalent of our Amish culture, that really they said, we'll just withdraw, we'll create our own alternative society, and maybe the government and the religious people will leave us alone, and we're just going to hole up. The reason we have the Dead Sea Scrolls is because of these kinds of communities, because at Qumran, that there was a community like that. And then there was at least one other alternative. And it was an alternative that said, hey, wait a minute. Maybe we should settle for like as good as it gets and just make the focus quiet lives where normal people can live normal lives. Now, I get that that's terribly uncomfortable. That's where I've got about the next 15 minutes to convince you that I haven't completely gone off the deep end. But what do we do with this stuff? Well, maybe we start here. When you pray, and I don't want that to be a shaming tool, but when you make a list of people you're going to pray for, or when you sit down to pray, where do you start? Who do you start with? If you're anything like me, there's tends to always be enough time in my day to pray for myself, which isn't necessarily a good reflection of me, but it seems to hold true. And for me, there's typically time for my wife and my kids, my friends that I spend a lot of time with, extended family, the staff. I almost always think of something on Amazon that I was going to buy before I get to anything beyond those things, if I'm being honest. There's these concentric circles, and it starts here and it emanates out. But Paul, who certainly believes in praying for other people, what he seems to be saying here in 2 Timothy is start on that outermost edge. And I'm not convinced that he's saying do this all the time, but it does seem like what he's pointing to here is an approach towards prayer that goes, start with the furthest edge where the men and the women who their decisions impact our everyday lives, the power brokers in the world, what we would call presidents, what we would call leaders, what they would call kings or Caesars, start there. That seems to be what's going on. Now, that's uncomfortable and it's uncommon, but what if that's part of what Paul's getting at here? Is there's this way of praying that starts out there. Now, that concept, I don't know how that lands with you, but if I were to say to you, hey, have you prayed for your leaders? A year ago, if you'd have said that to me, I'd have went why? I don't know about you, and I get that this speaks to my privilege, the fact that I'm a white male who lives in interior Montana, I get that. But if you just said to me a year ago, do you pray for your leaders, I would have been there's no urgency for that. I don't know about you, but that suddenly makes more sense to me than it ever has before in my whole life. Why? Because I think all of us, the combination of the pandemic and then this political, dare I call it chaos or unrest or civil, whatever you want to call it, it's suddenly, and we've talked about this going all the way back to February, suddenly it's somewhat comforting to me to know that I'm not the first person in the history of the world who's just frankly felt this need to beg God to send good leaders. Suddenly there's this clarity around that issue. This seems to be what Paul's getting at. Is he's speaking to a people. What's the context of the people he's writing to? Well, he's writing to Jewish and Gentile followers of Jesus. And what did a Jewish follower of Jesus know in their everyday life? And so did their dad and their mom and their grandma and their great-grandma and their great-great-grandma and their great-great-great-great-granddad. What did they know as a way of life? They knew being under a power that was unjust, that was not ideal, that oftentimes was trying to squeeze the very faith out of them. Why is the Exodus story the single central narrative of the Bible, in my opinion? Well, it seems obvious to me, frankly, because these people, they'd formed a whole way of life around begging God to send a leader who would give them their freedom. This was the way they'd been living at least since 586 BC, and that's if we're not talking about the northern kingdom. But along the way, these different approaches develop, and this is what gets us into how do you record history? Are you going to become among those who say we should arm up and take on Rome? Are you going to become among those who say, hey, we're going to hole up and form an alternative society? And Paul, to me, and we could talk more about this, to me what seems clear is that Paul, sorry, that's kind of an arrogant way to say that, but for having stared at this for a while now, it seems clear to me that what Paul is doing is he's aligning himself in the early church with this third option, which frankly wasn't new to him. It's hundreds of years old. In fact, there's this text that in the Old Testament that Tommy's referenced throughout this experience, and I've heard it but never listened, if you know what I mean. But it's from Jeremiah, and listen to what Jeremiah says in Jeremiah 29. He says, "But seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you into exile, and pray to the Lord on its behalf, for in its welfare you find your welfare." Remember, Paul is talking to people who are in exile in Babylon under a leader who wants to kill them and assimilate them into everyday culture. And what does Jeremiah say to them? Pray. Why? Because if it goes good enough, your life will go good enough. Again, what is that? Well, I think the technical phrase for that is, it's called selling out. Now let me read again 1 Timothy 2. First of all, then, I urge that supplications, prayers, intercessions, and thanksgivings be made for everyone, for kings and all who are in high positions, so that, why? Why should we do that? So that we may lead a quiet and peaceable life in all godliness and dignity. This is right and is acceptable in the sight of God our Savior, who desires everyone to be saved and to come to a knowledge of the truth. What if what Paul is driving at here is we need our prophets? Jesus certainly played that role more than once in his life. There's a whole host of them in the Old Testament. We need our prophets. This is what we've been talking about in this series, is this tension between speaking truth to power and treating people, all of them, as image bearers of God. What if Paul's message kind of becomes this idea that we need our prophets? We need those men and women who stand up to unjust rulers, who kind of drive us to a better place. But most of us are ordinary people living ordinary lives. And for most of us, it would just be nice if the government was stable enough so that we could live our lives. Now, I get how offensive that sounds. It reminded me this week, years ago when I was working at Harvest and Billings, it was just a couple years before we left, there was a couple national communicators who were gaining a lot of steam, especially among the people that I was sharing life with. And in my opinion, they were very mean and very angry, and they were the type of Bible teachers that, frankly, I just don't connect with. The irony was, I think in both cases, and my stereotyping in most cases, they got their Bible education from the same place that my boss did, Vern, who, by the way, is the single most talented, intelligent person I've ever personally known. And what was helpful to me, and this helped me kind of break through some of my stereotypes, just like having a friend on both sides of the aisle can help you break yours, was that Vern was nothing like that. He was the most kind, gracious, high view of people, respectful, not Christian-shaming person, leader that I'd known up until that point. And I remember processing with him, and just kind of candidly at one point, because some of my more close friends were beginning to kind of attack me from these guys' teaching. And I remember going Vern, I don't understand. These guys are so mean. And from my perspective, they were wrong just because they were mean. And I was basically saying so how are you so different than them? And I have forgotten, but I remember this week, he said, Adam, we need our prophets. We just need them to not sin in the process. On one level, that helps me respect that there is a place for people who point out injustice. I am so grateful, maybe you feel the same, I'm so grateful that God hasn't called me to be the president of the United States or to that level of leadership, to be maybe even frankly a city commissioner. Aren't you grateful for people who feel even that compelling vocational calling to lead at the local or the state or the national level? So please don't hear me saying that I think Paul is saying there's no role for that. Of course there's a role for that. That's a big portion of the Old Testament. But what if what had developed within early church theology was this idea that, yeah, we need that, but most of us are ordinary people, and we just need the government to be stable enough so that we can go live our ordinary lives and follow God in our ordinary ways and promote God in our everyday activity. I don't know if you follow David Brooks. I've really found him trustworthy in this season. And I was listening to him this week, and one of the ways that he says it is, what if politics is a very dangerous place to place our identity? And what if that's part of what Paul's getting at here? And we'll look at just a moment where I think I see that being the case. He actually goes on to cite this one study where they studied people who volunteer, and then they started to locate not only where they volunteer, so they study people who volunteer and where they volunteer, and then they made this observation that people who volunteer in politics are 7 times more likely to identify as lonely. Now, does that mean that there shouldn't be politics or no one should be involved? I don't think so. I think it means that our own personal friends who are involved, people like Emily and Colleen and Sean and others, I think it probably means we should be that much more grateful and praying for them, because it's a hard world. But what if what Paul's doing here is going hey, be careful. And by the way, he's not completely selling out. Think of this. When he says this, picking up in verse 3, and I didn't put it back on the screen, this is right and is acceptable in the sight of God our Savior. That's kind of a sticking it to the man statement. Because remember, Caesar claimed to be Savior. So Paul's not completely selling out. He's holding tight to the fact that this is God's world and he is king. And in fact, what we know is in Paul's day, there had been an arrangement, and this came and went in different seasons depending upon the severity of the circumstances. But Paul is probably writing to a people who were living under an arrangement that said, hey, we don't have to worship Caesar, because when Rome would conquer a people, those subject peoples were required to worship Caesar and to offer sacrifices to Caesar. But what we know from early church history is there were these different arrangements where they were able to work out, like, okay, Jewish people, you don't have to do that. Jewish Christians, you don't have to do that. What you have to do is you have to honor the emperor. And you don't have to offer sacrifices to the emperor, you offer sacrifices for the emperor. And in Romans, when Paul says, like, hey, all authority has been given to people by God, well, that's news to Caesar. Because as far as Caesar knew, he was God. He claimed, so Paul's not completely selling out. He's holding on to this prophetic notion that God is king of God's world, which brings me to this question. What if what Paul is doing here is actually guiding us through what is otherwise a false dichotomy? A dichotomy on the one side that says politics are the most important thing ever, and a dichotomy on the other side that says politics don't matter at all. Some of you naturally gravitate this way. If I'm being honest, I naturally gravitate this way. But isn't it just awesome kind of third way ethics and virtue and morality that Paul would go, wait a minute. No. Here's what I want you to do. Pray for your leaders. Pray that God would work through them to provide stable enough systems. And does that mean we want that system to emanate and become more and more just for all? Of course we do. Pray for your leaders. And what does that do? Well, maybe that's a conversation. I think we can quickly see it does lots of things. It helps you maintain the image bearerness of whoever you're praying for. It also helps you cling to the fact that, like, they work for God, whether they know it or not. And there's lots of examples of that from this story. Could you imagine or maybe this would be the question, how much different would your political anxiety be right now? And maybe I'm being overly pessimistic. I'm sorry if I'm assuming the worst about you. But how much different would your political emotion be right now if in the morning when you stood up and looked in the mirror, you knew that 5 days a week for the last year, you've been asking God to lead through people who are in charge of the world? And what might that do for your retention of the fact that you live in God's world, not Caesar's? And what might that do in helping you put enough emotion towards, but not enough? Or maybe for some of us, it would cause us to go like, no, I think I'm one of those prophets. I think I've got to go live in those waters. Remember, Jesus too saw the world as needing freedom. He too saw the world as under the control of a foreign evil power that people needed rescued from. But fundamentally, his way out was the cross, and we're going to talk about this in a couple weeks. You know, I've spent the last, probably you have too, 20 years at times being shamed that you're not Christian enough. Maybe you've experienced this. I think we all have if you've taken Jesus seriously at some point. Actually, I remembered this week back to Vern. When I was doing high school stuff, one of the things that we did is we took students this one year on a bus. You might remember I actually forgot to, I had the lease date wrong, but we chartered a bus to go to Denver to go to a conference called Dare to Share. And it was a personal evangelism conference. In hindsight, it was okay. We took a busload of kids there. It was fun. And then, of course, this is the early 2000s, and so then all this marketing material came, and the intention behind that was to get us to go a second year. And I actually can't remember whether it was our intention to go the second year or not. We didn't get to go, and the reason why is because they ticked Vern off. Because one day this postcard came in the mail, and again, Vern's this charismatic, funny, very intelligent, very high alpha guy, and this postcard came in the mail, and the front of it was shock value. That was the intention, and it just said, "Youth ministry is failing in America." And then you flip the postcard over, and it had all these stats. Like, you've probably heard them, all these harrowing stats of how kids who graduate from youth groups don't ever go to church, and just all this stuff. And that was their motivation to get churches to send their kids to this conference. And when Vern saw it, he did youth ministry for longer than I did. He was better at it than I was. He just loved students. And he was so mad. And he actually, and this gives you a window into his wit, he sat down at his computer and he found the director of the organization, and he wrote him an email, and he said, "Thank you so much for your postcard and sharing those statistics with us. I had no idea." And he said, "In light of the fact that our youth ministries are failing so terribly, we've fired both our high school pastor and our junior high pastor, and we've taken their whole operating budgets, and we've reallocated that for chairs in the auditorium." His phone rang before the day was over, and it was the director of that ministry going, "What the heck?" And Vern kind of let him have it. Like, how dare you use that kind of, like, what do you think we're trying to do here? Another way I've heard it, and you've maybe heard this too, is this like, oh, the Christians in China, the Chinese church is so much healthier than the church in the U.S. And I operate in the assumption that that's probably true on some level, that the average Chinese Christian who like could die for owning one of these, who can only hear about Christ through some underground network, I operate on the assumption that their faith is much deeper than mine maybe will ever be. But this experience, it's changed my perspective of that. Because to whatever extent that's true, that the average Christian in China has a deeper, richer faith than you and I could because of our privilege, okay, I'll grant that. But what I couldn't see before all of this is the accessibility of the gospel in China is tragically low. So yeah, we can celebrate the deep faith of those people, and I say, yes, we should. But what does a stable enough government do? What is, when Paul says, like, we could live ordinary, godly lives, suddenly it makes sense to me. Like, the availability of the gospel. I've worked in churches for 20 years. I've never seen it this low, have you? And this isn't about numbers. Like, look around. That's the number piece. And we're sitting back there going, there's 15 people in the room. This is amazing. We were out of a job a year ago if there were 15 people in the room. But this isn't just about, this is about influence. For me, it's never been about numbers. It's been about influence. It's about, I want that gal sitting in the bar who's going through a divorce to know, like, there's this church that's not as weird as I think Christians are, and they meet in this public space, and I think I'm hurting, and I think maybe my friend who I work with, she's been asking me to go, and maybe I'll go. And I'm perfectly okay with spending a couple years with her and helping her patch her life back together, and then we never see her again. Not my intention, but that's fine with me. Think of what the instability, and I'm not just blaming this on politics, but think about what the instability has cost just our little place in the last year. An egg hunt where we have 1,000+ people, trivial, but it creates influence. Easter services, an Ales for Trails event. I mean, I know more people who found us through Ales for Trails. I still think it's funny, like, people get mad at some of the stuff that I've done in the last couple of months. I'm like, we do a beer festival. Like, be mad at that. Seriously. Christmas Eve goes from 2,000 people in the Civic Center to 5 gatherings of 50. Listen, I'm proud of us and the interior work, but have you ever seen the gospel's influence be so low? Have you ever found it so difficult to go to church or invite someone to church, to talk about Jesus without stepping on some kind of political crack in the road? Might that make it clear why Paul goes, just pray that your leaders can create a stable enough government that the gospel can prevail? What happens if we read Paul's words as relevant 2,000 years later? And going, frankly, who your president is has less importance. than the stability of a culture that can be reminded perpetually by image bearers of God that this is his world, and he's in charge, and he'll put it back to rights. What happens if we take seriously Paul's invitation to avoid the dichotomy and pray that God would work through our leaders? Let me pray for you. Lord, we take comfort in the fact that you're in charge. This is your show, God, and we cling to the fact that we are growing in this season, and yet, God, we think of friends and coworkers and community members who the availability of the hope and the purpose that you bring is, at least by my read, never been further from them. And that the tricks that we can pull and the events that we can create and the relationships that we can build, it's never been more complicated, Lord. There's landmines everywhere. And so from our little corner of our little state, God, I pray that you'd do something in us that would cause us to at least put as much energy in praying for our world's leaders as positioning for which ones ought to be there. Amen.
If you would like to learn more about Narrate Church, find us at narratechurch.org or look us up on Facebook and Instagram.